Hello and what is shaking, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Wind Up Podcast, and we have the post-prohibition celebration episode for you today. That was on December 5th. That may have missed it. The lovely day that is garnered as repealing prohibition here in the great old US of A, and something that we in the wine industry definitely celebrate as much as we possibly can without going overboard. But it's not all fun and games this time around. I was looking over the course of the last kind of week trying to figure out, let's do something that's kind of themed with this particular time of the year and why we get to do what we do in terms of winemaking and, of course, enjoying a good glass of wine with friends, family, or even cocktails, beers, whatever it might be. But as I'm scrolling through the interwebs over the last few days, trying to kind of figure out which direction I want to take this episode, we found somewhat of an interesting and potentially kind of like troubling article about the state of the alcohol industry, where we're going, and a potential kind of neo-prohibitionist movement. So we're going to get into that today. Before we do, of course, we have some lovely announcements for everybody. And first and foremost, as always, thank you so much for downloading and listening to the show. Please, if you have a quick minute, please rate and review the show when you have a chance, wherever you're consuming the podcast. That does wonders for the algorithm and helping people find us. Two, please follow us on our social networks. We are most active on YouTube and Instagram. You can also find us on the Book of Face and the social network formerly known as Twitter. At MTGA Wines will be the handle for all of those. You'll see regular updates, including links to our episodes, cellar work, tasting notes, all kinds of fun and interesting things about the inner workings of the wine industry. Third, we are still brought to you by premiercrewclothing.com. You can head there. That's CRU, Premier Crew, CRU, clothing.com. Use the code PREMIER to get 20% off your first order at checkout. We got all kinds of fun, kind of kitschy, wine-related t-shirts that are meant to just be fun, great gifts for the holiday season. Please make sure you get your orders in. That way stuff actually has a chance to arrive before the holidays come and go. Is there anything else? I don't think there's anything else. I think that's all we got today. Let's just roll right into it, shall we? So this is something that we've mentioned kind of anecdotally on a few different episodes over the course of the last few months, is that we've seen kind of this downward trend in wine sales and alcohol sales in general, that there is kind of this anti-alcohol movement kind of sweeping through culturally right now. I think it's coming off the backs of a lot of pundits that are potentially ill-informed, potentially, taking kind of an extreme stance. So we'll get into kind of why I think that in particular. But before we kind of dive into this, something I do need to point out is that as much as, number one, I'm biased. I make wine for a living. Let's face it. All right. Like if I'm going to try and take a steel man for a prohibitionist movement, you'd be out of your damn mind, because I think I would hate that, because I would literally be out of a job tomorrow. Right. Number two, I am not a food scientist. I don't have a PhD. There's a boatload of information in terms of the biology behind this and the chemistry behind this that probably even I don't understand. Although if you gave me, at least some cliff notes, I would probably understand it. But thus far, I've yet to be convinced based on kind of the more clickbaity podcasts and articles and all this other stuff. And what I have found, instead of, this, hey, abstinence or prohibitionist decision, it's like, no, there's a great middle ground to be had here. And I think that's kind of the biggest problem with this discussion and kind of where it stands right now, is that you have a lot of people, those of you that listen to the show, myself, all of my colleagues within the industry, who are quite clearly big fans of wine, alcohol, and what it can literally bring to the table. On the other side, and for the opponents of our industry, you have a lot of folks that are basically of the opinion that any drop of alcohol is bad for you. that you're literally shaving years off your life the second you take a sip. And there's got to be a middle ground. You know, I think like many things, there are two very extreme sides to this. I think both sides have perhaps some valid points, but I think, as usual, there's some sort of middle ground to be had here. Now, the reason why I think that, and why I'm inherently skeptical, let's just for a second, let's pretend like I'm going to steel man or strong man the anti-alcohol movement. Let's say I'm on board with it. Let's say I change my mind, which will never happen unless I see a lot of scientific data that proves me wrong, in which case, you know, that I just don't think it's going to happen. But if that ends up being the case, I'll eat crow, whatever. But even if I was going to try to do it, it wasn't like this is in my own like consumer brain. Because again, I'm an idiot. I don't know that much about either sides of this, or like I said, the biology or chemistry behind this. But I remember not that long ago, if you ate too many eggs, you're going to increase your cholesterol, have a heart attack, and die. I remember that, I think it was the 1970s or so, maybe it was earlier than that, when margarine came out, that it was supposed to be the next best thing, and butter was bad for you. Real butter bad, fake butter good. And I look back at the 70s and the advent of processed foods and fast food and like all this stuff that's like, no, it's okay, don't worry about it. I look at all the GMO crops that are, quote, substantially equivalent to, you know, real crops that are grown. Turns out they're not really, they're just close enough. That's what substantially equivalent means. That for the most part, they're just like the real thing. And you see, like, you know, decades later, that, like, none of that's really, all these things are like, it's not true. Margarine turns out is terrible for you. It turns out that eggs are great for you. So when someone immediately takes kind of like this extreme stance of like, just don't do it, it's bad for you. I'm like, is it now? Shoot, I could take this even one step further. Let's take it one step further. This is crazy. Some of you might not like this, but this is an interesting thing. Because let's go to Nancy Reagan and the war on drugs. Let's go there, where you saw a huge swath of things end up as Schedule 1 verboten. You know, some of us remember reefer madness and what that was all about, right? And it turns out, you know, maybe smoking weed's not the best thing, inhaling smoke's not great. But, you know, as long as you're not operating heavy machinery, if you end up crushing two giant king-size bags of Doritos, that's probably the worst thing that's going to happen. Right? You know what's even better? Is that if you look at something and some of the research that's now starting to be done around like depression, PTSD, and you look at what things like magic mushrooms or MDMA are doing as therapies, and they've shown great potential in helping people through really tough times. Like, it's very clear that some of these prohibitionist things, whether it was alcohol, whether it's with drugs, or whether it's the promotion of processed foods and GMOs and all this, you know, or not, clearly the extremes are only part of the story. And that there's a lot of things that are kind of eaten up within the zeitgeist of a movement and just cast out. The baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, right? And it turns out that some of these things, like eggs, could actually be pretty good for you, right? I don't know how good magic mushrooms are going to be just for a casual user. I have plenty of friends who have tried them. They seem like they're a lot of fun. I may have tried them myself, allegedly. And sure, they're great. But, like, that's kind of outside the realm of normal, right? Probably. Psychedelics, probably a little bit out there. It's great for listening to Pink Floyd, though. I'll tell you that much. Whew, that'll do it. That'll absolutely do it. Cue up the Wizard of Oz and some Dark Side of the Moon. That'll do it. Point being that, once again, as soon as kind of an extreme stance is taken, I'm inherently skeptical. Inherently skeptical. Because the math just doesn't math. especially when there hasn't been enough research done. Now, when it comes to alcohol in particular, there's been a lot of studies. I didn't pull a lot of them for this, but I did pull an article that references a lot of these points. If you want to check out the article, it is What Do Neo-Prohibitionists Really Want? It was on the daily750.com. The link is in the description if you want to give it a read and kind of get the vibe of what's going on in terms of this kind of anti-alcohol movement that's picking up some steam. Now, the reason why this is kind of interesting and why I think this also ties into kind of like the downturn in alcohol sales is that, and this is stated in the article, that back in January of 2023, the WHO, the World Health Organization, stated that no level of alcohol consumption is safe for human health. That is the bullet point statement, the extreme. 0 means everything. A little bit, and you're toast. And this is where my inherent skepticism comes from. Like all the examples that I started with, even some of the more extreme ones that have shown use in certain therapeutic settings, that kind of verbiage just does not make sense. Now, as you read through the article, it's interesting to kind of hear who provided input into these into that decision and kind of into that verbiage. One was a company or a group called Movendi International. Another one was the U.S. Alcohol Policy Alliance. That was founded back in 2014. And then you have the Global Alcohol Policy Alliance, kind of like a few of the big players who helped kind of do the research and the legwork for some of that WHO verbiage. I found it really interesting that this Movendi International group was actually founded in 1851, and this is in the article as well, you can check it out, as the Independent Order of Good Templars, which apparently was influential implementing prohibition. I had no idea. That's fun knowledge. If you describe yourself as an Independent Order of Good Templars, that's a red flag for me, for no reason other than you use the word good or phrase Good Templars. It's also very old-timey, 1851. Kind of go for it, right? So clearly there are these groups that are whole hog into like all alcohol is bad, and that even a little bit is incredibly detrimental to your health. And that is kind of translated to younger people and even folks my age and older as well that have kind of created, what some are calling this sober curious, movement of like, hey, I wonder what it's like not to have a glass of wine or two with dinner. Maybe if I go the weekdays without it, or maybe, I kind of cut it out for like a sober October or a dry January or whatever the case is. Or like start the year off strong or kind of end the year strong. Like what if I try some of this stuff and kind of play with it and see how I feel? It's interesting. And I'm not mad at anybody who feels like they do that. I definitely didn't have a sober October. I definitely don't do dry January because New Year's Day, I'm having some bubbles to kick in the new year. I don't know about you. It's a champagne day on January 1st. That's what that is. But I find it interesting that even like there's like this article threw around a bunch of stats. I don't know how accurate they are. I'm hoping that someone there did their research. This was also posted on winebusiness.com. So I'm assuming someone did their due diligence, like, hey, this is a good article to like promote. But that there's there's an assumption that there's a huge majority, 3/4 or more of alcohol consuming people that don't overconsume or overindulge. Sure, we have our moments. It's a big college football Saturday. Maybe we started with a backyard barbecue early in, late morning. We had some bubbles or some cheap beer and we just started kind of going after. And yeah, we probably got after it a little too much, but it's not like it's a regular thing. It's not like we were going anywhere, operating heavy machinery, driving a car. Like we were safe and contained within our home. Fine. Right? Fine. The other side of it is just, if for that maybe 25% of people that do overconsume, is it in a way, is it something that can be curbed? Are these folks that are, full blown like junkie alcoholics? Do we think that 25% of alcohol consuming adults are junkies? I find that's hard to believe. They probably overconsume, but they're not terrible people. You do also see a lot of this movement kind of going back to just like old school, you know, 19 teens and early 1900s tactics of like, this is going to prevent, violence. This is going to prevent deaths. This is going to prevent, abuse. This is going to prevent, all kinds of things. It's the same argument, just kind of repackaged for a new age. And they're also quoted as saying, we're not trying to create a new prohibition. What we're trying to do is educate and let people know what the risks of consuming alcohol actually are, as if we as alcohol consumers don't know that already necessarily, And on top of that, it's this weird, like thinly veiled, like, I don't know. It's just a weird thing. I can't quite wrap my head around how I feel about it, because here's like brass tacks. If a person has a hard time having like a beverage, like if they have one, they have 20, alcohol might not be for them. Fair enough, right? If for those of us that enjoy, a glass of wine or two with dinner, and it's like, yeah, maybe we finish that bottle tomorrow, maybe we don't. And we're a little bit more casual and kind of flippant about it, what is that harming? You have, I believe he's a Stanford PhD and doctor by the name of Andrew Huberman. Brilliant guy. His podcast is fantastic. I love listening to it. And he's been quoted as saying that, that really, alcohol is a toxin, and that, realistically you shouldn't be consuming it. But if you do, you really shouldn't have more than 2 drinks per week. And obviously you can't like stockpile 10 and then drink, over the course of 5 weeks and then drink, 10 of them on a single day. Like that's not how it works, right? It's not a cumulative thing. It's just in general, right? Because the binge drinking thing obviously is a problem. We'll definitely dive into that here in a second. And this was on a podcast with, I'm actually going to kind of cite his show, a couple of his shows. He's a comedian, Bert Kreischer. And Bert's response to this was like, if someone, I'm paraphrasing, but it was like, if someone tells you they only have 2 drinks a week, they're lying to you and they're lying to themselves. And I have to agree. I have a hard time believing that someone who just doesn't consume alcohol, like period, would be like, nah, 2 drinks a week is fine. Like that's typically what I do. That's what I average. That just doesn't seem like it. Like if you're going to like go out and watch the game, you're probably going to have at least 2 that day. And there's probably another day during the week where it's like, let's have a bottle of wine and maybe we don't finish it, but we'll have that. Or maybe a cocktail as like a little bit of nightcap because it was a tough day today and I just want to put my feet up and relax. I kind of agree with him on that I don't, if there's someone that's living by that strict of a lifestyle, number one, good on them, because I definitely don't have that discipline. But number 2, I think they would be full of shit. Right? Now, the other podcast that Bert was involved in was one, I think it was just on his own, and the Hollywood personality guy, actor Dak Shepard, and who's a sober dude. And I think Dak had like the best description of it that I've heard in a long, long time. And because he described the day that was like his wake up time of like, I just need to be sober. But this was like a day that he was knee deep. Like he went and bought an 8-ball. If you don't know what that is, look it up. And then he went and got like a couple fifths of whiskey and then a case of beer, and then woke up like 3 days later not having any recollection of what had happened. And that was when he was like, oh shit, this is a problem. And I would totally agree with that. Clearly, that's an issue, right? You shouldn't, you shouldn't time travel, right? You probably shouldn't go 3 days and not have any clue what happened necessarily. That's probably not great. But he also stated that, and I think he might have asked Bert this. It was like, it doesn't sound like alcohol is impeding you or affecting you in a negative way or taking things away from you, right? And in which case, that is kind of what it is. Like, it hasn't hit you in a way that you realized it is taking away from your life, right? That it is a parasitic relationship. And I think that was just an amazing point. And again, I'm paraphrasing, that podcast episode, but it was like, Like this thing just doesn't serve me anymore. It could be like a friend who just keeps, or maybe if someone that's just, you're not as close with anyone, they just keep dragging you down, dragging you down. And you're like, I just can't hang out with this person anymore. Like every time it's just drama, and issue after issue. And there's such an emotional drain. At a certain point, you got to cut the cord, right? Probably for your own mental health. And I would say when it comes to alcohol, when it comes to fast food, when it comes to, any number of things, if it starts to affect your life in a negative way, you probably got to do some pretty intense self-reflection and be like, hey, is this actually serving me or isn't it? This is probably the only time you're going to hear a winemaker be like, go be sober if you want to. Because frankly, if you decide that alcohol is not for you because it's affecting you in a negative way far too often, that's fine. But as we've been talking about and what we said at the top, there's a middle ground here. And this is where I think, talking about like this sober, curious movement and that, there's a lot of people that just don't overconsume. There's a great average out there of like, yeah, we have a couple glasses of wine and I'm not hammered and I don't get hungover. Like it is what it is. Like it accompanies the meal. It's really nice. I think that that's where we need to land as a society. Now, we all know, when you get a group of friends together, you're hanging out, cooking, eating, hanging out, one bottle's open, then another, and then another, and then another. There are plenty of mornings. If you're listening to this show, there's probably a good chance myself, just like you, we have woken up with a headache, we're dehydrated, the stomach's not feeling too hot. We need an extra cup of coffee, some Advil, and probably some spicy food to sweat it out a little bit, right? That happens. But what do you do to recover? Are you drinking water? Are you drinking electrolytes? Are you trying to replenish your body and what you depleted it of that night before? Are you active in any way, shape, or form? Do you work out? Do you go for walks? Are you eating healthy? Are you doing a lot of other things to help inhibit the negative effects that alcohol can have on you, right? I mean, I had a great uncle, my great uncle Ed, literally drank himself to death. At a certain point, just stopped eating, only drank. And eventually just body shut down, Clearly had a bad relationship with alcohol. Clearly didn't take care of himself. He also chain smoked like crazy. I remember this so vividly. My parents or my grandparents, they conned me in as like a little kid, I was shorter than the desk I'm standing next to. And they got me to go, they're like, we want you to go ask Uncle Ed why he smokes and drinks so much. Like they literally sent me in as like the like artillery, to go try and convince my great uncle that his lifestyle was not a healthy one. So it's not as though I'm coming at this from like this jaded industry viewpoint that, hey, this is bullshit and you should ignore it because wine is fine. Don't worry about it. I mean, it can be. It isn't for everybody. Just like cigars aren't for everybody. Just like McDonald's just isn't for everybody. Just like, I don't know, insert whatever vice somebody might have that affects them negatively. Like there's people that are lactose intolerant, but they fucking love cheese and ice cream. And they're like, well, I guess I'm just going to be sick. Here we go. I have people in my life that are like that. I'm like, why would you put yourself through that? And they're like, because it tastes good. I'm like, well, all right, fair enough. So, it's reading this stuff. It's very disheartening at times because one, I think a lot of it is pseudoscience. Two, I'm inherently skeptical of anyone that starts barking these, extremes from their, pedestal or wherever the hell they're standing. Three, you look at the people who are involved and the organizations that are involved. It's like, clearly you've had an agenda. If you look at Movendi International, if this is actually what they've done since the late 1800s, it's been, 175 years that they've been at this prohibitionist kind of movement, this anti-alcohol kind of movement. So it's like, okay, like clearly you have an agenda. I mean, what are we supposed to assume from that? That you're not trying to be self-serving? Like, I don't know. it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing. And I think there's a great way to move forward. One is try and find this middle ground using on either side, whether it's the super pro alcohol people, the super anti-alcohol people, tone down the fucking rhetoric. It's like anything political these days. It's like, just calm down. Okay? Like, the world's not going to end tomorrow, hopefully. Like, let's have a cup of coffee, let's sit down, and let's figure this out. We don't need to be yelling at each other about this kind of stuff. Like, there are way more important things going on. Let's have a good old-fashioned discourse, argue our points, and try and convince one another that there's some common ground here. Right? That's just it. Like, stop it. Just stop it. The other thing is greater transparency. And all of you know, if you've been listening to this show for a while, transparency is one of those things that is like my number one thing. If you're new here and you haven't listened to the show before, transparency when it comes to alcohol is like number one on the docket for me. Because, and I'll remind everybody briefly, but for anyone new who's listening to the show, the alcohol industry is not governed by the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA has nothing to do with what we do and how we operate. We are regulated at the federal level by the Trade Tax Bureau. It is a tax agency. All they give a shit about is whether or not we're paying them money. The only thing they require of us is to put a few different things on the label. That's going to be the government warning, what it is, where it's from, how it was made, where it was made. Did I already say that? I don't know. There's like 7 or 9 things. The alcohol percentage has to be on there. The appellation has to be on there in the case of wine. Like, there's a very finite amount of stuff that we are actually required to provide to you, the consumer, when it comes to the information on the label. And that is the number one problem. Get this. When it comes to wine in particular, there's wiggle room. There's about a full % of wiggle room that if there's a wine that is technically 15% alcohol, that winery could label it as 14%. Now, I will tell you this, that wiggle room is not such a bad thing because depending on blending, you have to run these lab tests ahead of time to print the labels because you have to have the labels ready, right? So you get a sample, you submit that, and sometimes it's a little bit off. That does happen. Is it going to be off a full %? Probably not. Now, is a 14% wine really that different than a 15% wine? You can argue about that amongst yourselves. Realistically, it kind of is what it is at that point. For me, someone asked at the winery the other day, they're like, hey, we noticed that a lot of your wines, like some of the older vintages, we don't have this, but more recent vintages, it doesn't say like 14%. It says like 14.27. I'm like, yeah, because I like specifics. I want you to know, like, this is as accurate as I could get it based on the sample I provided before we had to get the labels printed. Like, this is the actual ballpark we're working with. It's not 14%, and it might be 14.5%, and it might be 13.5%. Like, it's somewhere. It's not just like this weird range. It's like, no, this is exactly where we wanted it to be, and this is the range we wanted it to be in. So we try and be specific. We've talked, man, please, for those that haven't listened to the episode, go back and listen to our wine additive shows. They're from, I think, last year or the year before even. We do a lot of talk about wine additives and how wines are made and what actually goes into them. And, we talked a lot about the wine revolution that may have started in Kansas of all places. Shout out to my good friends out in Kansas and Missouri. Good old, I'm right near the border of Kansas and Missouri in Leawood, Kansas. This wine shop that started, advertising how much sugar is in certain wines versus others. Mayomi. Anyway, transparency is everything. And for some reason, the alcohol industry just has never been on board with it. And that is a huge pet peeve for me. That if people are, let's say that this movement of anti-alcohol continues picking up a lot of steam. Let's just say it continues rolling, right? How can you help quell it? Number one, just shouting at people and saying, hey, no, you're wrong, your science is bad, and alcohol is actually fine. That's not an argument, right? You're just stating things. Okay? If you can actually say, like, hey, guess what? Yeah, this cheeseburger from McDonald's, probably not the best thing for you. This one from that I made at home from this grass-fed beef, and it's a organic, grain bun, and the lettuce came from our garden and so on. Yeah, it's probably a little bit healthier, but it's still a fucking cheeseburger, right? When you have wine and you have something that's doctored up with a bunch of extracts, additives, flavorings, coloring agents, whatever, and it's heavily processed like that cheeseburger from McDonald's probably is, then of course you're probably going to feel like trash after drinking that wine. And then when you drink a wine that, has little to no sugar into it, and it's made with quality products, and it's a less is more mentality, there's less manipulation, less manufacturing, and all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I drank a lot of wine when I was in Napa or at home last night, but we all drank high quality stuff. I don't feel nearly as bad as I thought I would. Why? Quality over quantity, plain and simple, right? Now, I think I did miss a point because we were talking about a lot of the, overconsumption versus underconsumption or whatever. Like the majority of adults do not overconsume. And I do think that there is kind of culturally within the United States, there is a shift in mindset that we have to have when it comes to alcohol. And many of you will probably relate to this, that it's like you're in college, you got half a beer, you want to go to bed, and some friend of yours is like, no fallen soldiers, and they yell at you, and you're like, fine, I'll finish it. And there's kind of this constant like tug of war with like, I still have this mentality where if we open a bottle of wine and it's the option of consuming it versus dumping it out, I'm probably going to consume it even if I feel a little rougher the next day, which is probably the wrong mindset to have, right? We should be a little bit more okay with moderation and not just slamming beverages because of the sake of, being wasteful. Now, I hate being wasteful, believe me. It's one of my biggest pet peeves is waste just in general, whether it's my time, especially my time, wine, food. I mean, I have total tangent. I have two couples who are great friends, some of my best friends, who just don't eat leftovers, period. If they make a whole bunch of food and they don't finish it, they just throw it out. And I eat all of it. If I can, if I happen to be present and around, I'm like, I will take whatever you're not eating home and I'm going to eat this for the next 3 days because that is wasteful. And that's terrifying to me. Now that's probably a little bit of an extreme, but shoot, I even eat leftover salad. Gasp. Yes, it's a little soggy. No, I don't care. It tastes fine. Now, the point at hand, changing our mindset is, if we're worried about this overconsumption thing, right? And I think we just have to kind of reset that mind that if you open a bottle of wine, and let's say it's a couple, you and your better half, whoever that may be, or a friend of yours, whatever, and you decide to open a bottle of wine. And you know what? You're pretty close to finishing it. And you're like, we've been hanging out for like 2-3 hours. We've gone through one bottle. We're halfway through another one. Maybe it's okay if we don't finish it. I think that's an okay mentality to have. I think it could potentially be, if you're worried about being hungover the next day, a better mentality to have. Now, if you write that check and and it gets cashed the next day and you're feeling a little under the weather, suck it up, buttercup. That's on you, right? We've all had those moments, right? Or it's like you get through a little bit of an evening and you're like, man, tomorrow's going to be a little rough. So you drink as much water as you can. You maybe take some preemptive Advil, drink some electrolytes, and you're like, all right, hopefully this helps. Shoot, I know I'm going to have one of these nights coming up on Saturday. Shoot. Me and the fellas, we get together and do a kind of white elephant gift, like whiskey exchange. It always gets a little out of hand, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I know that on Sunday, I'm probably not going to feel that great. But I'm going to do everything in my power to drink plenty of water, have a lot of electrolytes, eat a lot of good food, and do everything I can to kind of mitigate some of those effects. Probably try and go to the gym on Sunday or especially on Monday to like sweat it out a little bit. Figure it out. Do something, anything. There's probably some health expert out there that thinks I'm absolutely crazy for that kind of thing, but I'm okay with it for now. It works for me. Now, if we can change that mindset and if we can come to some sort of kind of moderate agreement that yes, alcohol is not for everybody. And yes, there are probably some of us out there that consume more than we should. But it's not affecting our lives in a negative way. It's not taking away from our health. It's not actively killing us. We're not being, drunk jackasses or violent or abusive in any way, shape or form. It's not taking away from our life or other people's. We're able to moderate it when we need to, when we have to. Then it's probably not that bad of a thing. If you can't do those things, and you become abusive when you drink, or you black out for days on end because you go on a bender, you probably should be a little bit more reflective and figure out, is this actually serving me in the way that I need it to, or is it no longer serving me in the way it should? Because I look at alcohol as a luxury. It's a fun way to take the edge off, enjoy a great meal, talk with friends. I am the shy, believe it or not, even though I'm doing this show, the shy introvert that has historically had a very hard time talking to people. So having a glass of wine helps because it loosens me up a little bit. I don't get as nervous. I stay out of my own head a little bit. So it's a little bit of self-medication for me, but I've seen great benefits from it because I have an amazing group of friends that I feel very, very comfortable with. I've gotten to know them. I know I can speak very honestly with them, whether it's with a glass of wine or not. I found this great middle ground in my life and how to use it as a tool, and now just the ability to enjoy it kind of at my leisure. That's what works for me. Does that work for everybody? Probably not. Does cardio work for everybody? Probably not. Does weightlifting work for everybody? Probably not. Does driving a stick shift work for everybody? No, and you know who you are, and you should have learned to drive one when you were a kid in the first place. But you only got taught to drive an automatic, and we do hold that against you a little bit. It's an interesting time for the wine industry. I do think that cooler heads will prevail. I do think that this is something that is, it's something that we need to kind of watch and keep an eye out on. I'm not convinced that there's a group of people out there that want to institute a new prohibition. It would not surprise me in the slightest if they thought that that was a good idea based on some of the rhetoric that they're using. Am I worried about it? No, but I'm paying attention. And I think that the way we fight this as an industry, and that's a strong term because I don't think we need to fight it, but we need to be more transparent. We need to have greater communication. We need to know the facts, figures, and numbers, which I am woefully behind on. And something that I know that I'm going to be working on over the next, few weeks, months, and everything moving into the new year to make sure that when someone comes out to the winery, because this happened literally 2 weeks ago, and someone's like, what do you have to say? Like, some doctors are just saying there's no such thing as a safe amount of alcohol. I'm like, well, they're quoting the WHO, which I take with a grain of salt. And I can tell you who helped them institute that policy, which also I take their opinions with a grain of salt. So, maybe the truth is that eggs really weren't that bad for you the whole time. But for some reason it got trendy and we ended up with just bad information for a couple of decades. I'm hoping that is not the case here and that we find that middle ground that I was talking about. All right. Oh, that's my venting session for the day. I need a drink. I don't know about you, but I'm going to go get one. Have a lovely rest of your day. This has been the Wind Up Podcast. Again, please be sure to like, subscribe, follow the show, rate and review it wherever you're consuming your podcast. Follow us on our social networks at MTGA Wines on Instagram, YouTube, The Book of Face, and the social network formerly known as Twitter. You can also check out Premier Crew Clothing, that's CRU clothing.com, and use the code Premier for 20% off your first order. Have a lovely rest of your week. Happy holidays, everybody, and happy repeal of prohibition. We're like 6 days late because this is getting released on December 11th, but better late than never, let's say. Go grab yourself a cocktail or a glass of wine or something. Cheers.